I dropped a whole 147-page contract document in.
The Applied AI Podcast, where tech meets ROI.
Mind blown.
I'm here with Dr. Alexandra Pasi, who is the founder of Lucidity Sciences. Dr. Pasi, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself for our audience?
Hi, I'm Dr. Alexandra Pasi, but you can just call me Lexi. I am a mathematician and logician by training, but I've been in the machine learning AI data space for a little over a decade now, so about 15 years. And I've, done a lot on the research side, but also working in industry. So worked in some corporate finance settings, worked in some very dynamic like data product startups. And then, of course, have this sort of theoretical understanding of what the technology does. So I'm very interested in sort of bridging from that foundational understanding all the way down to like the really nuts and bolts of implementation and how it affects businesses and how you sort of navigate the risk and reward dynamics within that.
Absolutely. And in the overall AI machine learning technology ecosystem, it takes all parts. So there are the people doing the actual theoretical research, the people building foundation models. And then, I'm sort of on the kind of other side of that, literally just applying this stuff to solve business problems and processes. And that's what my company's all about. So it's great that we can have this conversation because we come at it from two different approaches, but we're both very interested in the same things, which is, deploying these capabilities, creating and deploying them to solve real world problems and create more opportunity and more capability.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So why don't we start with disambiguating a couple of concepts? You hear people talk about AI as though AI is equivalent to large language models because those have sucked up all the oxygen in the room. And so you'll hear people make statements such as AI hallucinates or we're getting closer to AGI as though and then they're saying these things, referring to large language models. And of course, this is a sort of logical fallacy or kind of misappropriation known as synecdoche. That's the kind of linguistic term for it, where you take a subset of something and then you take some quality or characteristic of that subset and you refer to the entire set, with that subset. And so when you say AI hallucinates, that's obviously not accurate to all types of AI. It would be the equivalent of saying, well, I have asthma and I can't blow very well, so I can't play musical instruments. And it's like, well, obviously there are lots of musical instruments that you don't have to blow on, or into to make music, right?
It's funny. I've never heard somebody refer to this as synecdoche before, but you're exactly right. That's a really great way of expressing it. And I think that what I've always said, because like I said, I've been around the block in AI and machine learning since most people that are in the space right now, right? So there's obviously some people who've been in it much longer than me, but I have this kind of like hipster cred of I was in it before it was like cool in this wave, right? And one of the things that I have found really interesting is how the meaning of AI and machine learning has really drifted through time. So, like looking way back, and I'm sure we'll get into some of these different systems and approaches, but it used to be that like AI was this, larger, grander, theoretical sort of thing, and like maybe meant a little bit more like expert systems or sort of explicit logic around, how to play chess. And then like machine learning was a more probabilistic approach. And that's kind of fallen by the wayside, and then it kind of meant AI is neural networks and ML is everything else. But now it's almost become that AI is large language models, like you said. And the large language models are interesting because they're not even really AI or machine learning. They are an application of AI and machine learning to an enormous corpus of language based data with a bunch of engineering wrapped around it, which is still a really cool engineering feat. But I think that people would be surprised to know sort of how deep the layers go, where what you're interacting with when you're interacting with like a use case specific LLM based agent is actually like the very tip of an iceberg that goes probably 7 or more layers down from there.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're saying that AI and machine learning it's the overall discipline brought to bear to create this experience people are having interacting with a large language model that's built again, like you say, on this large, multi-layered conglomeration of stacked technologies and disciplines.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of, I think that in some ways, AI has become more of a marketing term than a technical term which is fine, but it's really ambiguous as a category, right? And so I think in a lot of cases, you're better served looking at the problem first and then having a conversation about like, okay, what's the shape of this problem? Based on the shape of that problem, what tools are going to be the best fit? And you can also work backwards, right? So you can kind of, do some exploratory work. Like I have this incredible technology. Where does this connect with some of my opportunities? But I think that we are ill-served to just go into the world and be like, I am going to implement an AI strategy. That's kind of a meaningless notion. You got to start with like, I'm going to, try to make a change and an impact for my organization of this type. And I know that all of this incredible technology is available for me to be able to do that. Or I have a really deep understanding of what technology is available. And I'm going to kind of look out into the world and see what opportunities that opens up.
Absolutely. You're speaking my language because with Talbot West, obviously, as you know, we help companies adopt these types of technologies in a way that makes sense for them. And we always start with what's going on in your company and what are the actual needs, what's going to make a difference. And that might not even be AI. It might be some type of automation that doesn't rely on AI at all. It might be some very deterministic, simplistic algorithm. It might be some type of machine learning. So it's like, oh, you need better visibility into your supply chain and able to predict, when your supply chain is going to break down or is at risk. Well, that might be some type of a predictive algorithm that involves some type of machine learning trained on past data. That's not going to be a large language model. Oh, you need to generate marketing materials faster with a minimum of human oversight. That's probably going to be a large language model. So what do you need first, and then scoping that to what the capabilities are that are out there that fit that need.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, probably a lot of businesses out there would be either delighted or horrified to find out how many millions of dollars they could save with just a beginning algebra equation, right? So it's not always going to be that, but there's often a lot of cases where like, the right answer is, here's this kind of simple algebra 1 problem. You just have to look at it in the right way. So I'm in the machine learning space. Our technology that we've developed answers some really, really difficult questions within that space that are otherwise kind of difficult to approach. But if there is a better solution with like a simple equation, I have nothing philosophical against that. In fact, I would recommend that kind of approach every time. But I think usually it's going to be in concert with a lot of different technologies. And that's where this question of like architecting your strategy, both on the technology and the business side, really comes into play.
100%. Like a huge portion of the work is just in the correctly scoping and defining the problem, and then an overall strategy that ties a lot of moving parts together, because these businesses are, or any organization, it's a very complex system with a lot going on, and there are a lot of unintended consequences if you don't properly scope all the dependencies, precursors, and adjacencies, rather than just come in with this hey, I have a technology that it's so awesome because I know it's so awesome because I'm the one who's selling it, and so therefore it's the answer to every business's problems, and that's not the right approach.
Exactly. Well, and I think that like people learn certain patterns of like a tool that they're comfortable with. So I saw a lot of this with, and nothing whatsoever about like AI chatbots for internal knowledge bases. Like there's obviously place and utility for that. But I feel like just because a lot of people had like learned and picked up the tools to do that, that suddenly became like the big play. And I think what you have to do before you invest a lot of time into building something like that out is step back and say, what is this going to change for my business? Let's say I knock this AI project out of the park. Where does that show up in my P&L? And then does that make sense then for me to invest in this? Because you can have the most perfectly executed AI project in the world. And if that project wasn't tied to like a lever that you could pull that would, change something you wanted to see in your financials, you're going to be disappointed with the ROI.
Yeah, I agree with that. You definitely need to tie these to specific business outcomes. In some cases, it might not be directly traceable to like your P&L. If, let's say, you're building a long-term roadmap toward greater organizational intelligence, when your whole organization is going to be much more efficient, and you can clearly articulate what that future state looks like, and you can architect out some steps on the roadmap there. Not every one of those steps might directly move the needle, but some of them might be important precursors to other steps that will move the needle. So if you're doing it as part of an overall strategy where you've clearly shown how that strategy is going to deliver ROI, then absolutely. But not necessarily every single step is going to directly tie to P&L on its own. And that's actually a lot of the problem we see is people are looking at individual steps or solutions in isolation from the bigger picture.
So that is such a good point, because I think that what you're really talking about is this question of like digital transformation versus, these task level initiatives. And so this is just kind of my personal observation from watching this space. But one of the things that I think I've seen happen, let's say macroeconomically, is that, during the zero interest rate period, there was a lot of like padding of teams with like a lot of technical people. And in order to justify that, I think a lot of organizations created increasingly siloed roles. And this wasn't just in tech. Certainly tech experienced a lot of this. But within those sort of siloed roles, the tasks to do became a lot more well-defined. And it's really easy in an era where businesses are now trying to become more efficient to just say, oh, well, let's automate away all those tasks. But I think the more powerful thing to ask is like, why did these tasks exist in the first place? And was there a better way to organize sort of information and work across our organization? And I think that a lot of businesses, as they try to automate these tasks with AI, are going to find that there's actually a lot of gaps that things are falling through. And that's going to open their eyes to what it would look like for the business to be shaped a totally different way. And then that transformation is what's going to create the real impact. And everybody will be like, oh, AI automated a bunch of stuff. And like, sure. But the real transformation is not going to be the automation of tasks. It's going to be the transformation that is forced by trying to automate all of those tasks from the inefficient business model and seeing what falls through the gaps and trying to adjust and correct for that.
Oh yeah, that's really well said. And I've talked about the same thing. I don't think I've ever said it quite as nicely as you just did, but that's such a valuable and important truth for business executives to grasp.
Yeah, I think we're still figuring it out, right? But we'll get there and we'll look back, and I'm hoping that we can see kind of that arc a little bit more clearly.
Absolutely. I'd like to learn more about your specific company and product. I think before we jump into that, how about I pitch you some different, because we talked a minute ago about scoping the right technology to the right task. What about if I pitch you some real world business problems and you kind of tell me like, oh, I would go to this type of technology or that type of technology for this specific instance. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, I love that. And this is completely on the
It
fly
is, yeah.
too. So
We have not
full caveat, you know, there's always going to be a deeper dive you want to do, but I love this
For the
idea.
audience, we have not scripted this. We have not rehearsed this. I didn't even tell Dr. Pasi I was going to throw this at her. So this is completely thinking on her feet. And we won't hold you, too accountable to anything because it is hard to think on the fly. But let's say back to the example I was talking about a moment ago, where a company wants to optimize its supply chain, and obviously supply chain stuff has so much inefficiency, and you're probably talking about an entire suite of different technologies for different aspects of supply chain optimization. But let's just say one aspect is you want to be able to predict when a supply chain breakdown is going to happen or when it's likely to happen. There's probably going to be like a probability score assigned, and you're going to be looking at past data, the different ways that breakdowns happen. A supplier is underpowered and just can't deliver, or global macroeconomic factors, political factors, who knows what, right? There are all kinds of things that can cause a disruption in your supply chain, and you want to be able to essentially learn from the past and be able to monitor. So there's a monitoring aspect. You want to be able to monitor what's going on and then essentially flag with some degree of probability when a disruption is likely to happen, so you can take some sort of mitigating action. So how would you go about constructing some sort of AI solution for that? What types of AI technologies would you use?
Yeah, I love this question. Because I think that like on paper, if this is a perfectly observed system, right? If you can observe all of the pieces and you understand all of the pieces that go into it, there's probably a lot of ways in which this can be explicitly modeled, right? So you've got like a graph logistics problem and you can solve it mathematically using some like explicit equations or graph heuristics. In reality, that's often not going to be the case. So if it is the case for you, fantastic, you've hit the jackpot, like very low risk implementation of an explicit, solution to this problem. But like you talked about, there's often these macroeconomic conditions that like we understand have an impact on the supply chains. We just don't know exactly how it ripples through, right? And that's kind of the perfect setting for these, we'll call it structured supervised learning. You've seen, and that's kind of a mouthful, but I'll sort of explain what shape of problems fall into that camp. So if you have a bunch of historical data where you're pretty sure I can observe the major contributing factors, I have that historically, and I also have the outcome, right? So I have, what quantity of this particular item arrived, what price, and that's the thing that I'm actually trying to forecast out. And I'm trying to forecast that out under new conditions that I've never seen before. That's where you actually want to use one of these supervised structured machine learning approaches. And machine learning and AI in general finds patterns, right? So the question is, how well does it generalize out those patterns on different kinds of data? Because when you're talking about planning for the future, you're talking about data that the machine sort of definitionally hasn't seen before. That's why you're trying to use something like machine learning. And so that's actually the space that we operate very well in. That's one of the things that we've done when we've designed this technology is try to solve for an issue that we saw around these models not generalizing adequately. And the other thing too that I'll mention is, and I think this is really important for people who are not, I'm not going to try to get too deep in the weeds, but if
you
you're
can
not
get a
deep
little,
in the
you can
weeds,
get a little
yeah,
in the weeds. It's okay to get just a little in the weeds. Don't worry about it.
fantastic. I love to hear that. You might regret telling me I can't. But, structured data you can think of as like data that goes into a spreadsheet, right? So that's very different from like text or image-based or video data. You've got these different fields, they all have values, they're related to each other in some sort of predefined configuration. And an LLM is not going to be the right tool for structured data for a particular use case. And that's really just because the LLM understands the world through the lens of the language that it's learned based on, a bunch of articles, but also the history of tweets and all of those other things that have nothing to do with solving your particular supply chain issue. You're also going to have a ton of historical data and insight on your problem that an LLM will not have. So it's got all of this noise from irrelevant context, and then it doesn't really have the context of your organization. So this is where you would want to use something, and getting more specifically down into the weeds, historically what a lot of people have used here is something like AutoML, right? So an AutoML solution, AutoML is basically like try a bunch of different machine learning models at once and jam them together. That has the upside of often the fit is good, the downside of sometimes it doesn't generalize out well to new scenarios, and also a downside of those models can be kind of hefty. So if you're trying to like implement them on small devices or inference, and use them very quickly, they're not a great choice. So, but AutoML has often been one that people go to. XGBoost is another one that people go to. And then our technology is a new one on the market. That's exactly the kind of problem space that it slots into, but it has, sort of better than the accuracy of AutoML, but it's still lightweight like an XGBoost would be, so that it's a little bit more portable.
Yeah, this is probably a great place to jump in and just kind of pitch a little bit about what you're building. I have a couple other use cases I want to throw at you, but since you already kind of created the perfect segue, why don't you tell us more about Aleph One, your product, and what you're doing there?
Yeah, so our machine learning approach really aims to solve, I would say, two big problems in that supervised machine learning space. We've already talked a little bit about when you will want to use a supervised approach for structured data, and there are a ton of these problems. This market has been around for decades. It will continue to be around forever, really. Like the space of problems is not going anywhere, but there has not been a lot of advancement in this space algorithmically for a while. Most of the advancement has come, like I said, from taking a bunch of different models and kind of jamming them together. One of the things that you see when you take that approach is that the models then lose a lot of their generalizability. And what I mean by generalizability is, you have a specific training set. The world outside of your training data is very dynamic. how well is the algorithm going to predict the future or a new set of, under a new set of situations given its limited training data. So one, we set out to solve that model generalizability problem. And we do see significantly improved generalization. So there doesn't tend to be any difference that we see between, for instance, like its fit to train data and its fit to test or validation data. The second piece that we wanted to solve was really just around model size. So often these AutoML solutions are not super accessible to businesses that want to train on premise, depending on sort of the scale of their infrastructure and their data. And then also, even if you do have access to the ability to train them, the models themselves can get quite large. So if you want them to inference very fast, inference is like when you're using it, or you want it to be small enough to put, on a wearable device or a smaller device, you want that sort of edge compute optionality, maybe a mobile device, you're also quite limited there. So we've solved both this problem of model size and lightweightness and speed, and model generalizability. And the way that we did that was really just, we're a team of mathematicians. So we went back to answer this fundamental question of how do machines learn patterns? And, our thesis, and this has been borne out, is that, neural networks, decision trees, which are sort of the other algorithms out there, learn patterns in very naive ways. It's sort of like connect the dots. And the world is not linear. So the world does not connect the dots. You kind of look at a picture of a cat with the connect the dots, and you can sort of figure out there should be a curve here between these two dots. And that's not something natively that these algorithms are very good at doing. So we've introduced a new mathematical framework that's sort of natively nonlinear, natively finds those curves, and it finds a global solution so that you're really answering that question for the whole space of possibilities and not just for what you happen to put in as the training data.
Really cool. I love that. And so far, what specific use cases have you found the most applicability for?
Yeah, so we've spent a lot of time really looking into sort of higher risk settings to start, and that was because those are the places where generalizability is going to matter the most, right? And accuracy is going to matter the most. So we've taken a look at we've taken a look with collaborators at some projects in clinical care, so predicting and preventing pressure injuries and other adverse hospital events. That's something that we're able to do much better than the existing AutoML solutions. So you compare that to sort of like 80 models jammed together, and we're outperforming it in sensitivity and precision. So that's sort of, looking at how well are you going to predict the thing, how often do you get it right, and then how often do you sound a false alarm? Because both of those are important in business settings, right? Like you want to get the answer right, but you don't want to get the answer right at the expense of raising the alarm every single time because you just don't have the resources to address that. And certainly in an ICU setting, that's a major issue, right? You have limited staffing resources, so you need to be able to have higher precision with the alerts. And so that's something that we've looked at, and we found that we're able to significantly improve the state of the art in. We've also looked at applications within financial trading. So these are very, very dynamic data sets where the market is always kind of changing. You can't count on what's happened historically to tell you what's going to happen tomorrow unless you're finding the right patterns that actually speak to the governing dynamics. So we're able to increase returns in these highly liquid markets while reducing some of that risk. And then the last application that's been really interesting, I think, from a scientific perspective, is we've looked at some particle physics data and really trying to, in that context, detect rare events. So, these are often very rare events that are being looked for. And I think that's another interesting application of machine learning is, you might be able to simulate what does a rare event look like, but finding a machine that can pick those patterns out and not lose it in the noise, that's an algorithmic challenge for sure. And those are the sort of high risk, high precision, high accuracy settings that we've focused on so far.
That's great. But if you were to generalize, like our Aleph One model is good for the following types of situations and kind of in the broadest generalization possible. So not specific to industry, but like kind of just broadly categorize the types of real world challenges or use cases. I know it would be something around, one prerequisite would be you'd have to have enough data to actually, train the model on, and there would probably be a few others. So how would you sort of frame that if you were just giving the broadest generalization possible?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say structured data, it doesn't have to originally be structured data. We see a lot of cases where you pull a structured value out of unstructured data. So you might have some sort of sentiment score that ends up as one variable next to like something like, consumer price index. Like, so, in a lot of cases where you're doing something like demand forecasting, you'll have a lot of original structured data sources, but then when you pull them in, you want to structure it. You're just going to say like, here's in some inflation metric, here's sort of consumer sentiment metric here, here's some historical demand information. But the point is, you have to have some of that data structured. So you can think of that as like being a spreadsheet or database form. And then the second piece is you want to actually be forecasting or predicting or automating something. So you want a specific sort of label that you're trying to produce. And oftentimes that's a forecast. So as far as classes of problems, you might be looking into forecasting like cost or demand in these scenarios where you don't have perfect insight into the exact mechanics of what creates demand or what creates your cost in these sort of more opaque supply chain situations. Another application is you might be looking at anomaly detection or failure state. So there's some failure state and you're trying to preempt it earlier, and you have some historical example of failures. You can sort of learn, what does the system look like where it's being monitored right before a failure occurs, and can I use that to intervene earlier? And then you might also have some applications where you're making sort of like real-time decisions, right? So you might have multi-sensor synthesis in a robotics or a wearables application, where you're trying to take information from all of those sensors and then make a decision to, send some sort of signal or move some sort of direction. And then the last case that I think is really interesting too, that I think is underexplored, is exploratory machine learning. So this could be things like simulation. One of the things that machine learning provides is not just sort of a prediction of what's going to happen, but a model of how outcomes happen. And because of that, you can also use machine learning models that are good ones, right? So with good fit, with good generalizability, to sort of go in and say, okay, well, like, this is what happened, this is what will happen, but what would happen if I changed this, right? And so then you can really start to interrogate those questions of intervenability and optimization and what if planning in these very complex and dynamical systems without having to go make that bet for your business.
Yeah, that's sort of like how they had that big ML breakthrough back whenever it was, when they finally were able to have these breakthroughs in beating chess and other games. It's they figured out that they could actually have it simulate millions of games, and learn from its own simulations, right? So I think that has relevance to that last point you were making.
Yeah, synthetic data is a big area of interest right now, and there's a few different ways to generate synthetic data. One of them is through the machine learning models. But then there's this really good question of, if I'm training other models on synthetic data that I generated with a machine learning model, then if that machine learning model was not good, if it didn't generalize outside the original real world training set that I put in, I'm in trouble as I'm ingesting and making decisions off of subsequent synthetic data. So you really want that machine learning model to be solid if you're going to do simulation and create synthetic data off the top of it.
Yeah, there are there are a couple of use cases, and this is circling back to what I was originally throwing at you, but it's sort of tying it all together. And you said, a prerequisite is having enough data collected, but I want to throw a couple of use cases at you where maybe there isn't data, but you still have something you want to solve or a problem you want to optimize. And I want to see if synthetic data can help with that. And you can comment on whether Aleph 1 would be applicable, or, comment on whatever type of AI or machine learning you might bring to bear to solve these. It doesn't matter. But the first is, it relates to what you said about pulling in a lot of sensor data, and we can generalize beyond sensors to just say this could be a lot of data from a variety of sources. And what you're trying to do, you may not have past data, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to synthesize and cross-reference all this to find a signal in the noise. So you might be trying to find a specific pattern, and you may not even know what you're looking for, but you can retroactively identify it once it happens. You can say, so let's just say it's fraud detection, which of course this has already been pretty well figured out by a lot of the financial companies, but it's the first thing that comes to mind, where you're synthesizing all of these signals, and then retroactively you can say, yes, that was fraud, and it can sort of learn as it goes. But you don't necessarily let's just say it's a situation you don't necessarily have a large body of data to train it on. So you're kind of learning on the fly and giving it, sort of reinforcement learning, labeling stuff as it appears. And then essentially what you want it to do is get better at identifying these patterns on its own and then eventually being able to predict them. So that could be one example, but essentially you're just pulling all of these signals, trying to find patterns in them. You're looking for specific things. Could be fraud detection, could be terrorism, the likelihood of a terrorist attack could be. There are a lot of places you could use this sort of thing across the intelligence communities, financial markets, government, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one I want to throw at you. I'll let you respond to that, and then I have another one.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly fraud and anomaly detection is sort of the, like you said, that classical machine learning approach for this class of machine learning and AI tools. But it's interesting too, because like if you're in a case where you can model some of the aspects of the dynamics of the system a little bit more explicitly, you can create synthetic data off of that. So, a lot of people, there's something called a DAG, directed acyclic graph, that you can use to kind of map out the causality of a particular situation, right? So if you are in a case where like you understand what causes failure, right? You understand the mechanics that cause failure. You just need to be able to like make that decision really quickly, or like sometimes it's these mechanics with a little bit of noise. What you can do is you can actually model that out like on paper using this DAG, which is like a graph that's just like, if this happens, then this happens. If this happens, then this happens. And you can use that to simulate a bunch of different scenarios to produce that data. And then you can create a little bit of noise artificially on it to be like, okay, and then like maybe the sensor had this kind of error in the measurement. And you can use that to create a synthetic data set to train a machine learning model to understand like, okay, here's, you had the mechanics to construct the data set, but you also understood where the error was. And then the machine is going to learn the patterns of how can all of these pieces interact to create patterns that I can identify as, an error state or some sort of security breach or whatever the case, terrorist event, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, I'll throw another one at you. You're trying to optimize a lot of factors. You have an outcome you want to achieve. You don't have past data to guide you, but you just need to have machine learning, say, hey, this is my set of constraints. This is the outcome I want to achieve, which is like the most optimal something. I'll throw a real example of this, and it's a current client of Talbot West. We haven't created a solution around this. We're just initially scoping it. So this is perfect timing, but it's a company that does environmental monitoring, and they have a lot of clients across, hundreds of different sites spread across several states. About 100, maybe 120 technicians that have to go monitor all these sites. Each site might be on a different schedule. Each technician lives in a different location, and it's really like it just causes your brain to explode to try to like even figure out who should visit what site when and how to get the most. You're trying to get the best bang for your buck with human hours spent, have people drive the least amount of distance, all of that, right? And so it's not like you have a lot of past data. I mean, you have data on where the locations are, you have data on the schedule of when each location needs to be visited and reported on, and you have data on where each person lives, their, locale. And so given that, you want this machine learning model to just tell you a optimal schedule that's going to optimize everything. And I suspect, I'll let you speak to it, but I suspect the answer is having it run simulations and grade itself on those and create its own synthetic data. But why don't you go tell me how you would approach that, and if Aleph 1 would be a good candidate for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really interesting example because this does have a really explicit underlying structure, right? So where you are trying to sort of generate more data, you can absolutely generate some, again, this is really similar to the prior example, that you have this underlying graph structure of like who lives where and where they're trying to go and how long is it going to take. So you can come up with an explicit solution in those cases. But then there's probably a lot of places where you want to be able to add in some error, on time. And you can model some of that explicitly, but, as you bring in more and more extrinsic variables that you want to also use for specific pieces of the forecast, this is where you might start to want to bring in a machine learning solution. So I think that, what I would recommend in a case like this is there's a lot of explicit modeling that can be done, depending on sort of how broad you want that set of scenarios to be able to be expanded, right, for you to be able to accommodate for. And the pieces that are maybe blind spots in that explicit model, you can then start to gather additional data to supplement that, call it a synthetic data set, and turn that into a machine learning problem that sort of expands the domain on which the model operates. So that's a really cool example where you do have some explicit model ability within a specific domain. And then depending on how you want to expand that out, you may end up bringing in a machine learning solution where something like an ALF1 can really help to run simulations and generalize given a number of sort of external variables that are not yet accommodated for within that specific explicit model.
Yeah, and so the model could run a lot of simulations, and essentially you could build in all the variables you needed. And you could even imagine a situation many times more complicated than the one I just said. Far more complex with far more variability and far more factors. The one I said is actually, like you said, relatively simple because you really have three factors, but you could bring in like dozens of factors with tons of variables, right? And so the model could run all of these simulations and essentially be grading itself. And essentially you could give it the parameters it's optimizing for, which is least miles driven, least human hours spent, or something like that, right? And so it can run a lot of different simulations of how it would route drivers in different ways, or different schedules it could create, and then grade itself on those, and eventually come up with the optimal one and report it to you, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you might, for instance, just care about distance, and distance is something that's fixed, and that's great. That's really easy to model explicitly. But if you start to care about time, then you're taking in, things like traffic. And then there's a bunch of external variables that come into that are a little bit foggier on how they interplay. And so you can use machine learning solutions to help predict some of those variables, and then either plug them in explicitly or kind of invert that problem. But either way, you have sort of this like explicit modelable core. And then you have machine learning that can be brought in to sort of, carry some of the uncertainty extrinsically, like things like traffic, if that is one of the variables that you're optimizing for, or if some of the variables that you're optimizing for have these more external factors that are not as explicitly modelable.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I like that. Well, anything else you'd like people to know about what you're up to?
I think that a lot of it is where we started, really. That just that there's different kinds of machine learning. Um, the hallucination question is not, as relevant with certain types of approaches. So there are really good ways to mitigate and quantify the risk that you're taking on with AI adoption. But a lot of that just comes down to understanding the landscape of what's out there. So there are a lot of options for businesses that are looking to implement AI. I think to really significant impact. And a lot of that will come down to, like we discussed, understanding your strategy, not necessarily just looking to automate a specific task. You got to kind of think bigger. But then on the flip side, as you're looking to mitigate the risk of making those changes, if you're looking to transform your business or the way that you do business, the last thing you want is the machine learning model and some technical quirk thereof or some hallucination being like a major part of that risk. And luckily, there's really important ways that you can mitigate it. And a lot of it's just using the right technology. And then I think another piece is a lot of businesses are concerned about cost, right? Going into adopting AI. And there's good news on that front as well, which is that there are a lot of machine learning and AI solutions that require less compute. You're not going to wake up in the morning to a devastating surprise cloud bill, and are a little bit more approachable to implement. You just have to be willing to do the critical thinking about how you're trying to change your business, and then working with people who can help you understand, or taking that to your team who can help you understand where to bring the right technologies to bear on the problem.
Just said it better myself. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast. We'll have to have you for a follow-up discussion.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. Thanks so much for having me.